morning subscribers and welcome. G-Economics here, running you through figure 7 on the A593 stimulus material. What do we have here, ladies and gentlemen? It is the market for copper, shown here in periods of equilibrium and disequilibrium. You will know equilibrium, the point at which demand is equal to supply. Happens rarely in this diagram, once and twice. All other points we see disequilibrium, where demand does not equal supply. We have areas where the supply is greater than the demand, and hence we have a surplus, and we have areas where the demand is greater than the supply, hence we have areas of shortage. I'm going to run you through some diagrams which you may use and may be expected to use in the exam in order to interpret this information. The one thing I would point out, ladies and gentlemen, is of course this is in thousands of tons, so really we're talking 17,500 thousand, which is really obviously 17.5 million tons. Just nota bene for that one. The questions which I have been looking at with my students are as follows. We've been looking at interpreting various points on this diagram using demand and supply. So the beginning of 2009, the beginning of 2011, and then also considering just at the end of that, if I move this down a little bit, also considering the price elasticity of supply and the price elasticity of demand and how that would impact the prices. So let's get to it. Let's get to some diagrams, ladies and gentlemen. So this is my diagram for the beginning of 2009 and what's going on in the market at 2009. You'll know that here we have excess supply. Supply of around 18.4 and demand of 17.5. Illustrated by this particular diagram. So what we are saying here, ladies and gentlemen, is as follows. We are saying that the initial equilibrium is here at point A, where in the first instance the demand is equivalent to 17,500 tons, or 17.5 million tons. However, we know from that diagram that the supply does not equal demand at that point in time, because we know that it's actually around about 18,400. So we see that we have demand here and we have an excess of supply. Now that is probably because obviously the supply has shifted to the right, increasing the amount of supply in the market. As a consequence of that, ladies and gentlemen, what is likely to happen? Well, what is likely to happen is that in order to clear the market, in order that demand once again equals supply, the price will fall to this new equilibrium point, point B, establishing a new equilibrium price and a new equilibrium quantity. So the impact on the copper market for the copper miners, for example, would be that they would obviously see a reduction in price level in order to clear the market of copper. So that's the first point. Moving on then, ladies and gentlemen. The next point that I asked my students to consider was 2011, this point here, where we can clearly see that in this instance demand is greater than supply. So I'm saying here, if I move this on to the next diagram, I'm saying that in 2011 the initial supply in this instance is 19,600, reading off from the chart. However, at that point in time we know that demand is greater than supply, and we know that actually if you read the data off the chart it's around about 20 million tons. Why might that have happened? Because there's excess of demand in the market, hence the demand curve may have shifted to the right. So our initial start point equilibrium here is at point A. Again, what will happen in order to clear this market? Well, the excessive demand will pull the prices up so that the market then clears at this new equilibrium point B. And so once again we establish a new equilibrium price and a new equilibrium quantity supplied and demanded. So in this instance, due to the excess demand, that will pull prices upwards. Whereas in the previous diagram, we saw that the excessive supply forced the prices downwards in order to clear the market in both instances. So this is quite a sophisticated way of looking at this analysis, ladies and gentlemen, and you can do this in a couple of ways. I've done a more straightforward way with my students, and I'll be looking at this next week. For those of you who are looking at this in your textbooks, can I refer you to pages 28 and 29 of the OCR GCSE textbook, where you will find similar theory and analysis to this. But obviously in this instance now we're applying it to a particular market. And then the final thing, ladies and gentlemen, which I would draw your attention to, is the final question which I put to my students was for them to discuss the likely impact on prices given the relative elasticities, price elasticities, of both demand and supply. You'll be familiar, I'm sure, with the term commodity, and copper being a commodity. And the demand is likely to be rather inelastic, and the supply might be rather price inelastic also. Now just bear in mind the likely impact of that on a copper miner and a copper producer and a country which earns the majority of its income from the export of copper, such as Zambia. The Copper Bullets in Zambia, their football team, sponsored by the local copper mine, for example. If we were to take that very first diagram that we drew and draw a very inelastic demand curve to signify this very price inelastic nature of the demand, we can see here that even a relatively small increase in demand, so you'll be familiar that we had sort of these points illustrated on the last one, so we started there and ended up at this point B. Well, even a relatively small increase in supply results in very significant price reductions. So it's quite a big drop there. And similarly, if we consider the supply relatively price inelastic once again, and again you'll be familiar with, we're obviously starting at this point A and we finished at this equilibrium point B on the previous diagram, where we had the excess demand. If I've drawn that out a bit further, let me just do that. So our demand curve coming down here. Now again, in this instance, because the supply is relatively price inelastic, the change in demand once again results in a very significant price increase from P1 up to P2. And it's this inelastic nature of supply and demand which means that the copper producers will suffer very big price swings when there are changes in the relative levels of supply and demand. And of course, I mentioned in my question there this whole notion of a derived demand. Derived meaning comes from. Well, of course, the demand for copper comes from the global demand for copper as the global economy grows and contracts and slows down. And obviously, as the global economy increases in size, then the derived demand increases. But as the economic cycle takes a turn for the worse, then the derived demand falls. So this sort of very volatile, oscillating nature of the price would be something which would be common in a commodity market such as the copper market. So ladies and gentlemen, I'll leave it at that for today. Bye for now.